of city and county buildings, council chambers located at 1 Tacoma Drive, or watch live on Channel 8 and through live streaming on Broomfield's website. The public may also participate in public comment either in person by calling 855-695-3744 and pressing *3 to be placed in the queue for comment. Please note that if you're calling in for public comment and would like to speak on more than one agenda item, you'll need to press *3 each time to be placed back in the queue for comment. Public comment will be limited to 90 minutes total per item. The first 1 through 15 participants in the queue have 3 minutes to speak. The next 16 through 25 participants have 2 minutes, and if time remains, the next 26 plus participants in the queue have 1.5 minutes to speak. Again, if joining virtually for public comment, the number is 855-695-3744 and press *3 to be placed in the queue. Screeners will ask callers for their first and last name and neighborhood and the agenda item the caller would like to comment on. Please call several minutes before the agenda item and press *3 to be placed in the queue for comment. If you're joining in person, we'll ask you to step up to the podium and state your name and neighborhood for the record. The City Council regular meeting is called to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Anderson. Here. Cohen.
Here.
Hinkle. Here. Jezerski. Leslie.
Here.
Lamb. Here. Lindsted.
Here.
Marshall.
Here.
Schapp.
Here.
Ward.
Here.
Thank you. A quorum is present. Will everyone please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance?
To the flag of the United States of America, which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. In an effort to keep order for tonight's meeting, I ask council members to limit themselves to 5 minutes. If council members are given an opportunity to speak for a second time on an item, they should limit their comments and communication to 2 minutes. The clerk will be assisting with timekeeping, and council members will be able to see their time on the podium. We will plan on a 10-minute break at approximately 8 p.m. We will begin with council's review and approval of this evening's agenda. Council may add or remove items from the consent agenda, or council may revise the order of business for a meeting. Does any member of the council have any comments or questions regarding this evening's agenda? Are there any objections to this agenda being approved? Seeing none, this agenda is approved. There are no petitions or communications this evening. We will move to public comment next. This is an opportunity for the public to comment on matters other than the items already listed on this evening's agenda. As mentioned earlier, the public may comment both in person or via phone. If you're joining on the phone and want to be placed in the queue for comment, please call 855-695-3744 and press *3. If you're joining in person, please line up behind the podium. Public comments will be limited to the time limits outlined earlier. Is anyone in person? Next is public comments via phone, and we do have one individual. So we will go to Mr. John Hubbard. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, Mayor Pro Tem, and council members. Thanks so much for your time. My name is John Hubbard. I'm a resident of Ward 1 in Highland Park South. And I would like for Broomfield to participate in the League of American Bicyclists Bicycle-Friendly Community Program beginning in 2022 with the goal of improving Broomfield's bikeability over time. The Bicycle-Friendly Community Program was launched as a way to help communities establish a plan to become more bicycle-friendly city and have specific measurements and metrics to manage that path. 23 other cities in Colorado participate in this program, including Denver, Boulder, Lakewood, Arvada, Longmont, and Colorado Springs. Participating in this program maps to the goals of council priorities such as sustainability, transportation, public health, and affordable housing. Enrollment for the next application cycle begins in May 2022, and I'd like to use the months between now and then to get the ball rolling within the city and county of Broomfield and have Broomfield participate in this program. I recognize now is not the time for discussion of this item, so I will follow up with an email to the council group. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hubbard. Any other public comment? I'm not seeing online, so next is council's community and event updates. Does any member of council have an update this evening? Moving on. Council's consideration of the consent agenda item is next. The clerk will read all of the consent agenda items by title, and there will be one opportunity for public comments and council questions. Council will then be asked to approve the consent agenda with 4 separate motions, as item 7D contains motions for the Board of Health and the Board of Social Services, and 7E is a request for an executive session and requires an individual motion. Because the 2 items on the consent agenda items are Board of Health and Board of Social Services, we will convene those 2 boards at this time. The meeting of the Broomfield Board of Health is called to order. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll for the Broomfield Board of Health.
Anderson, here. Cohen,
Here.
Hinkle,
Here.
Jezerski, Leslie,
Here.
Lim, here. Lindsted,
Here.
Marshallson,
Here.
Schaff,
Here.
Ward.
Here.
Thank you. A quorum is present. Next, I'll call the meeting of the Broomfield Board of Social Services to order. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll for the Broomfield Board of Social Services.
Anderson, here. Cohen,
Here.
Hinkle,
Here.
Jezerski, Leslie,
Here.
Lim, here. Lindsted,
Here.
Marshallson,
Here.
Schaff,
Here.
Ward.
Here.
Thank you. A quorum is present. Now we will return to the discussion of the consent agenda. Following the clerk's reading of consent agenda items 7A through 7E, we will ask for public comment. Will the clerk please read agenda items 7A through 7E by title?
7A, approval of minutes from February 8th, 2022 regular meeting. We'd like to know a clerical error correction to item 7A, February 8th, 2022 minutes, item 11D to show Leslie and Ward voting nay. 7B, resolution number 2022-34, granting a conservation easement in gross to the county of Boulder for Johnstone Farms parcel 5E and 5W. 7C, resolution number 2022-41, authorizing and approving the First Amendment to the city and county attorney's employment agreement. 7D, resolution number 2022-35-BSS, delegating authority to the city and county manager and director of human services to execute any intergovernmental agreements and grant documents on behalf of the city and county of Broomfield as necessary for the operation of the Broomfield Department of Human Services, including the Broomfield Workforce Center. Resolution number 2022-36-BH, reviewing and renewing delegation of signature authority of intergovernmental agreements and government funding documents as related to the Department of Public Health and Environment to the city and county manager and public health director.
Thank you.
Item 7, I keep doing, sorry. 70, request for executive session regarding discussion of personnel matters involving the city and county manager and the city and county attorney.
Thank you. We will now proceed with public comments. Does any member of the public have comments on these agenda items, which includes the 2 items for the Board of Health and the Board of Social Services? Not seeing any online either. Does any member of council, the Board of Health, or the Board of Social Services have comments on these agenda items? Sailing through. Is there a motion by council that the recommendations contained in the staff reports for agenda items 7A through 7C be approved? Thank you. Councilmember Ward.
So moved.
And a second, Councilmember Marshallson.
Second.
Is there any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. We don't need a roll call, right? We're all here now. And Mayor Pro Tem Jezerski has joined. Now, is there a motion by the Board of Social Services that the recommendations contained in the staff report for agenda item 7D be approved? Board Member Ward.
So moved.
Board Member Henkel. Is there a second? Thank you. All in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. And unless there was discussion. No, I didn't think so. Okay. Is there a motion by the Board of Health that the recommendations contained in the staff reports for agenda item 7D be approved? Board Member Ward.
So moved.
Is there a second? Board Member Henkel. Second. Thank you. Is there any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you. Next is council's consideration of consent agenda item 7E, a request for an executive session. Will the city and county attorney please read the motion?
That an executive session be held on February 22nd, 2022, following the end of this regular meeting for the purpose of discussing personnel matters related to the city and county manager and the city and county attorney as permitted by CRS section 24.6.402.4 F sub 1.
Thank you. Is there a motion? Councilmember Marshall.
So moved.
Is there a second? Councilmember Ward.
Second.
Is there any discussion? All in favor? And as a reminder, request for executive session required an affirmative vote of 2/3 for the quorum present. All right, thank you. Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you. Item 8A was reviewed earlier this evening. Seeing there's no further business before the Board of Social Services, the meeting is adjourned. Item 9A was reviewed earlier this evening. Seeing there's no further business before the Board of Health, that meeting is adjourned. The first item under council business this evening is council's consideration on first reading of proposed ordinance number 2178, amending the Broomfield Municipal Code relating to reverse setbacks for residential land uses from producing and shut-in oil and gas facilities and notification requirements. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, which I'll ask our staff to summarize.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, council and community. Anna Burton-Zetti, our co-director. I'm still trying to work on that between she and Katie Allen, and Director of Planning really took the lead on this. It's been a tremendous amount of work. Andrew Valdez is also with us tonight, as is Pat Gilbert, who's really carried the yeoman's lift, the three of them to bring it to where it is today. Anna, please give us an update. Again, this is second reading. I apologize. I just want to make sure everybody was awake. We're talking about reverse setbacks, Councilmember Lynn. I know that Ms. Rogers also has some feedback and direction before we go to the dialogue section. Ms. Burton-Zetti.
Thank you, and good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, City Council. As we have had a few discussions regarding reverse setbacks, we had some study sessions in March, April, August of 2021, and we most recently had a study session in January of 2022 regarding reverse setbacks. City Council has reviewed and approved ordinances 2156 and 2164 regarding reverse setbacks from plugged and abandoned wells, as well as the pre-production facilities. And so during the last study session in January of 2022, the focus was really on setbacks related to producing and shut-in wells. And there was also some extended discussion regarding potential updates to our notification requirements. So first, I'm going to go over some of the proposed changes related to the reverse setbacks that are included in the draft ordinance this evening. And then I'll conclude with the proposed changes to the notification requirements. We could have the next slide, please. There was considerable discussion regarding the potential changes, and in reviewing that discussion, staff felt that the direction that was provided was to have an increased setback from currently 250 feet to 500 feet for most of the existing wells in Broomfield. Those are the vertical and diagonal drilled wells, with an increased setback to 2,000 feet for the horizontally drilled wells. Next slide, please. The ordinance incorporates the same exceptions previously included with the prior ordinances, including exceptions from previously approved and existing residential development, as well as exemptions for the property that's zoned A1A, the agricultural areas annexed from Adams County. This largely encompasses the Wilcox neighborhood north of 144th Avenue. It also includes some other additional agricultural areas in Broomfield. It should be noted that in addition to this list that's on the screen and was included in the memo, reverse setbacks implemented by this future ordinance would not be applicable to properties with a vested rights agreement. Next slide, please. This map was also included in the staff memorandum prepared for this item. It shows the potential setbacks of 500 feet from the producing and shut-in wells that were vertically and or diagonally drilled, as well as the larger setback of 2,000 feet from currently producing or shut-in wells that were horizontally drilled. As additional wells will be plugged and abandoned, or additional wells could come into production, this map would be changing in the future. For example, this map does not show any of the producing wells, at the United pad at the southwest corner of 160th and Huron Street, but those are expected to come into production, and then a 2,000-foot setback would impact some of the adjacent properties, including the 5 rural residential lots at the northeast corner of 160th and Huron Street. Next slide, please. Staff included some of the development projects like that corner at 160th and Huron Street that could be impacted as they're adjacent to or in the vicinity of existing oil and gas wells or planned facilities. This is a little difficult to read on the presentation, but it is included in your memorandum. Next slide, please. The changes to the notification requirements are listed in the screen and are much more detailed in the staff memorandum. As noted in the staff report, there would be significant challenges with enforcing some of these notifications, as we'd be making changes that would occur to all lease agreements for renters, as well as whenever a property were to change hands in the future. Staff does not review and does not have the resources to begin reviewing all lease agreements and all property purchase agreements. And for this reason, we just wanted to highlight that in the staff report and in this presentation, that the monitoring and enforcement of this notification will be highly challenging. And that concludes staff's presentation this evening. Happy to answer any questions that may arise regarding the draft ordinance.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burton-Zetti. We'll now proceed with public comments. Does any member of the public have comments on this agenda item? If so, step up to the podium and state your name and neighborhood for the record. You'll have 3 minutes. Anyone? I'm not seeing anyone online. So we'll move on to questions from City Council next. Members should limit themselves to questions during this portion. The time to introduce amendments and state positions for or against this item is later. I wanted to ask our city and county attorney, Nancy Rogers, did you have anything you wanted to say in advance of this for clarification, or did you want to? Are you, no?
I was going to wait.
Okay.
Mayor, I was going to wait to respond to certain questions because I didn't know if there was going to be questions for staffs on the substance of the ordinance at this stage before we move to deliberations and consideration.
All right, thank you. Any questions for, Councilmember Hinkle?
Thank you. We can discuss this in a little bit, but I moved to postpone the first reading of this matter to March 29th and then suggest a date and staff can look at the planning agenda for the second reading.
We have a motion to move this item to what date? Sorry.
March 29th.
March 29th. Is there a second? Councilmember Lindsay?
So
Do I do a roll call vote or I'll have to do a hand count?
Or should we discuss?
well, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, this is a debatable motion, so council can focus on the request to table and debate whether to table or not necessarily the underlying question of the ordinance, and then it requires a majority vote.
Thank you. So is there any discussion? Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor. Considering we had a study session on this and many of us have requested that we look at financial assurances first before we make any further decisions, and that discussion won't happen until next week, I believe. We need to really make sure that we're following the process and just everything that we have requested in public comment before we move forward as what we had requested before. So in order to move forward publicly, I feel like we wouldn't be following the processes of which we had asked for to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Councilmember Shack?
Thank you, Mayor. This one caught me a little bit by surprise, by the way, we've had this conversation regarding reverse setbacks for more than a year now. So this has been a long time coming. Financial assurances are something that's being discussed by the state legislature. There's been some talk of, perhaps a unique ability to look at financial assurances on a local level. So I'm curious from staff, how is financial assurances and reverse setbacks related? And does financial assurances conversation need to happen before we move forward with the first reading of the reverse setbacks?
City and County Attorney Rogers or?
Thank you for that question, Councilmember Schaaf, and that kind of opens up the dialogue from the conversations that staff has been having about the how one impacts, if at all, the other, and making sure that we're comparing apples and apples and not apples and oranges. So,
And I think that metaphor of fruits is good. We are in the fruit world talking about apples and oranges though. So these are related, and while they may influence each other, I don't think they have a direct impact. One is a legislative act, an ordinance that applies to developers. The other is an incentive, not a mandate. Let me backtrack. The developers are getting a mandate. If this passes, it will be an absolute, thou shalt not put residences any closer than X feet. The financial assurances are different because it's an incentive for operators. While we hope that this will be an incentive that truly will result in the plug and abandoning of wells, it's only an incentive, and an operator need not follow it. So while they're related, and knowing that an operator has to pay a financial assurance now, if that passes, may mean that the negotiations between a developer and an operator are a little bit different than they are today regarding moving forward and plugging and abandoning that well, so the developer can get a shorter setback. That's a possibility, but that's how they influence each other, but they're not really directly impacted. Staff is looking at financial assurances as another tool in the toolbox to address this issue. It wasn't really presented as a replacement for setbacks.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. We'll move on to Councilmember Lindsay.
Thank you, Mayor. Would financial assurances need a first and a second reading if we're to move forward with it?
If they do, Councilmember Lindstedt, and we have that tentatively scheduled for April 12th would be the first reading, and May 10th would be the second reading.
And I guess that's on my I have some comments. I'll make them get to comments, but that's my only question.
Is this questions or is it discussion? I think it's discussion debate.
Oh, we're doing debate. Okay,
Yeah.
good, very good. Appreciate that. I guess, I was one of the council members that had some reservations about moving the setback specifically forward before that conversation. And I think it would be really prudent to move these two things forward together. I have some real process concerns, and I may actually vote for this in the long term. On second reading if it gets that far, but I have some real concerns with the process of having this come up with a setback number that's firm after the study session that we had. It was very clear. A member of this council explicitly asked what the consensus staff got from this council. And staff said that they didn't have a setback number. And now we're here with a setback number before the discussion on financial assurances that I thought we were going to have. And I really don't like that. I don't think it's a very good process for us to be making decisions, without having all the information on what our other ordinances in the future could do as we try to solve this problem. Because I think all of us want to see these low producing wells plugged and abandoned properly for a variety of reasons. And I don't want to see this take 10 or 15 years, but we haven't even had that conversation yet. So I would like to just see this delayed 1 month and have these things run concurrently on the same meetings, because I think it makes a lot more sense for us to be better informed, and I think it respects the direction that I thought was very explicit from this council at the last study session. So that's my preference, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Marshall, I lost internet too, just so you know, I'm trying to get back to the CRL site.
Thank you, Mayor. A couple questions. So if we do the reverse setbacks, that then puts the pressure on the developer, right, to work with the operator to plug and abandon the wells?
Yes. Yes, Councilmember Marshall. And we have heard anecdotally that those can be really challenging negotiations for the developer because they don't have much leverage in those discussions.
So the developer doesn't have a lot of leverage. Is that what you're saying?
The oil and gas operator can ask their price. How much will you give me to have me plug this well?
So I guess the question is if we're offering incentives to the operators, that then puts more pressure on them to plug and abandon the wells? Is that kind of the direction we're thinking? Gives them the incentive.
Separate and apart from developers, now we have something to the operators to give them an incentive to plug and abandon, whether or not there's development going on, development even nearby. This would apply to all wells in Broomfield.
I guess my initial thought on this part of it is, I believe that we need setbacks from these oil and gas operations, but I also don't want to let the operators off the hook by putting the pressure on the developers. I think is kind of the way I'm thinking. Is the operators the ones that are polluting the environment and should be on them to fix the problem, I guess. The opposite side, though, other question is, if we delay this, how many proposed developments will fall under the exempt from the development? Do we have an answer to that?
I don't want to say our side of the house, but the planning side of the house can answer that.
Thank you for the question. So I think to answer the question is a little tough because it depends on how much of a delay occurs in terms of if it's forwarded a couple of months. We do have some projects that are in a pre-application stage that are within proximity to the wells, but probably 1 or 2. If it was extended more than a couple of months, there's a potential that those projects could move into the approval process, but it really would, our approval process takes a good 6 months to a year. So it would have to extend that far for it to impact development proposals.
And well, I understand that the developments that have vested rights already, the ordinance of the setbacks won't apply, correct?
That is correct.
Will the ordinance related to the notifications of residents, will that apply to them?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So if someone has a vested right to build this, and it's 150 feet or whatever, within the 250 feet or 500 feet, they then still have to, going forward, still have to notify all homeowners, lease or fees, all that. Okay. That's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Jaworski.
Thank you, Mayor. So I understand that we're dealing with apples and oranges, and the apples are the setbacks. How far developer can, how close I guess they can get to a producing well, and then the oranges are the incentives for the producers, the oil and gas driller, to go ahead and plug a well after it's done producing. But as you mentioned, the decision on the one can influence our decision on the other. That was my takeaway of this. Our discussion and decision on financial assurances, while different to some extent from setback, can influence our decision, because if we get strong financial assurance language, I guess that may lessen the need, in some people's minds at least, the need for setbacks or what those setbacks are. So if I'm wrong on that, let me know, but that's my takeaway. And if that's the takeaway, then I would understand and support Councilmember Lindstedt who is suggesting that we take these two in tandem and not apart. And I think in that instance, I think it would make sense to move this back. And I think the question that was also answered that I had in my mind, but was also answered now, is that if we did delay this by a month, I think of it as being proposed, sounds like there wouldn't be any harm in that from the city's perspective.
We don't have anything, if we went with the March 29th date, that would be impacted.
So given there's no harm, no foul, and it seems like it may make sense to have FPC, I think I would support the motion by Ms. Councilmember Henkel.
Madam Mayor, can I jump in with a process question for both Councilmember Lindstad and Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes, please.
What I heard you say is that you were actually interested in something a little different than what Councilmember Hinkle's motion on the floor is. Her motion on the floor is to table to March 29th. What I heard both you say is you would be interested in this mimicking the timeframe for financial assurances, which is April 12th and May 10th. You could ask her if she would like a friendly amendment to her motion on the floor. And then if the second agrees, which I assume Councilmember Lewis that you do. So that would mean the motion on the floor now is a motion to table to first reading April 12th, second reading May 10th. It would mirror financial assurances, assuming that doesn't change for some reason.
Thank you so much for that. I was about to go back to Councilmember Lindstedt and ask, but I am still dealing with no internet. All right, so now that we have a friendly amendment, we need to have discussion on the friendly amendment.
Yes.
Tabling to April 12th and May 10th for first and second reading respectively.
Yes, and Mayor, just once again, the debate right now is on tabling, not necessarily the substance of the underlying ordinance.
Thank you. Any discussion on this friendly amendment? No? Yeah, it's on table. Okay, Councilmember Lynn, you were next anyway.
As Attorney Rogers mentioned, I mean, we need both tools. This is a tool that we have to protect not only, I guess, incentivize the P&A-ing of the wells, but to protect the health and safety of the residents living in proximity to these legacy producing or shut-in wells that leak and have emissions coming from them at times. So I think we have to keep that in mind. There are two tools to incentivize, but the reverse setback and it has an additional component, as I see it, to protect the health and safety of the residents who would otherwise live in closer proximity than whatever the reverse setback is. So I see this as something that should go forward now after we've talked about it for a year. That this ordinance should move forward, and that if some interesting development happens in the March 1st executive session, then we have second reading on March 29th, where things could be amended. So that's what I support moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Marshall Schultz.
So second reading on this one, if we pass this on first reading tonight, is when? Is it possible to just push that back until the April 12th date of when we're doing first reading and potentially on the incentives?
So another way to get to the parallel path without calling it a parallel path. Correct?
Yeah.
A different motion, but yeah. Did you make one? Okay. No.
Councilmember Leslie.
You know, this is new to me, all this stuff. And it's really important stuff. And it does, as our colleagues have said, speak to the health and safety of our community as well as our environment. I would like to suggest, and I don't know if this is necessary for a motion, I'll make it if needed, but I do now like the idea of the two components being discussed in parallel. I do think that makes makes sense. I do think that they are not separate. But I would like to propose that we have another work session before the readings. So we have an opportunity for more in-depth discussion about how the two align, where they don't align, and in particular, the topics of the setbacks. Why one standard for this kind of well, why a different standard for that kind of well. I feel, even though I know you all have been talking about this for a year or so, I feel that that would be valuable for me to be able to make a more informed decision. So if we defer these discussions until April, if we could use maybe one of those other dates for another workshop to give us more time to get more in-depth and be better prepared for the discussion on when the readings take place, I would like to suggest that.
Thank you.
Staff will do as directed. Yes, staff will do whatever council finds the most value in, of having those questions answered. I would defer to those Councilmember Lim and Councilmember Schaaf, Councilmember Anderson, for those that have been championing this, of what that best methodology is to refresh without relitigating reverse setbacks. So again, we're happy to say the why, the what, the impacts. I mean, and again, whether it's providing that executive summary and or additional, maybe a workshop versus a council meeting. But again, we'll defer to the council for direction on that.
Yeah, I was suggesting a workshop. And in addition to what has already been presented, I would like to see more discussion about the interrelationship between these two mechanisms. Because I do believe that there is a relationship. The question is, how do we most capitalize on that relationship for the benefits of the taxpayers and homeowners and neighbors? And then that draws you back to the setbacks. Then, okay, well, if we can shut these wells down with this incentive, what does that mean for the distance that we would agree to? Where right now I'm uncomfortable with saying it should be X or Y because I'm not sure what the other effect might be. Okay, that's my recommendation. Thank you.
And Mayor, for council's indulgence, if Ms. Rogers could kind of walk through Councilmember Lindstedt's point about open-ended on the setbacks versus coming up with a number. So as we continue with this conversation, if Ms. Rogers could kind of fill us in on how those numbers were arrived at, it might be beneficial for the following conversation. If we open that up for, is there more dialogue about what that setback amount is, and how those numbers were arrived at, Ms. Rogers?
So after the meeting, those of us on, we'll just call it the reverse setback team, went back and listened to the meeting and went through the notes again and tried to hear the message and the direction that we got from council. And as Manager Hoffman pointed out during that meeting, consensus doesn't always mean direction because we did not have consensus, as you all know that night. It was challenging for staff, and we made a call as a team, knowing that council has the ability to propose amendments to the numbers. What we did hear and what staff was definitely in favor of was different setbacks for different types of wells, multi-wells, horizontal wells, vertical wells, and then it was putting in those numbers. Again, we went back to the meeting and acknowledged that there wasn't consensus on 2,000 feet or 500. But we knew this had to come to first reading. We had to put something in writing. We didn't want to come to council with a blank. And so staff made the call to do 500 and 2,000.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. Is that all, Councilmember Leslie? Next is Councilmember Ward.
I have a question about the process if we were to, let's see, with Councilor Marsh Holsham suggested in delaying the second reading till the first reading of the supposed first reading of the incentives. Does that motion have to be made today, or can we make that motion the day the second reading is currently scheduled? Just table it for another day. That's my process question.
You can make a motion to postpone at any time. So you can make it at the start of second reading.
Okay, thank you. That's my only question for the time being.
Thank you. Councilmember Cohen?
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to the fruit metaphor. It sounds like a lot of people see this as like Gala versus Honeycrisp. And I think it was originally stated we're talking about apples and oranges, which are decidedly different, and you will agree. So I'm having trouble finding the linkage between two different mechanisms with different targets and different tactics and how they relate to each other in any way. I think it's clear setbacks is related to a health principle. I think we all agree that if the wells were made safer, that the setbacks could then adjust to a smaller radius. And the other one is more Johnny come lately, but late attempt to try and bring accountability to the oil and gas industry to clean up their mess. And I think we all know that I don't think any of us have great high hopes of their effectiveness, but at least sets a message. So I guess I'm not moved yet. I don't see the linkage and why we have to move these together. They seem like two separate arguments to me.
Thank you. Anybody want to comment on that? All right. Next is Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. And I just have a couple of questions. I want to call attention to what Councilmember Lim had noted, that this has been about a year. We're going back to March 31st of 2021. We had a discussion about the distances. And I'm just curious from staff's perspective, do we anticipate that anything's going to change in the next couple of months, or we're going to have something that, because studies that come forward that gives us an exact distance that we need to use if we have more time?
No, and if we did, we too would much rather wait on something that is definitive. And Councilmember Anderson, I think we've been quite frankly that's been parallel with these conversations on setbacks from the very beginning, particularly on the reverse setback pieces. So it really is it's not a science. It's not a science. There's multiple studies and from the health impact and not dialogue with regards to the economic impact. So those studies that are out there with regards to health, they don't take into account. So it makes it even more complex and complicated for this council, once again, to be on the front lines of making these decisions without having that metrics of how much do you weigh, and do you weigh it, right? Or do you default on one side or the other? So long answer, Councilmember Anderson, we don't anticipate something coming forward that's going to make it easier for you all to make this decision.
Thank you. And then and I appreciate the description of how we got to the 500 feet for the vertical wells in northern Broomfield and the 1,000 feet for the large scale facilities. And the consensus is top. I see that. And so if we pass this ordinance on first reading, can we change that distance on the second reading based upon the discussion of the financial assurances? The framework will remain the same. We just change the setback distance.
Yes, Councilmember Anderson, and your question brings up an interesting point about what first reading is for. First reading is to pass through an ordinance to the process so that it can get to second reading in the public hearing. It doesn't bind a council member. It doesn't need to be what your final vote would be. It just is a vote to say, I want the process and discussion to continue on this item.
Okay.
Thank you, and I think that helps quite a bit, and I really think we do need to move forward with this, so thank you.
Thank you. We're still going on discussion, so Councilmember Ward is next.
Thank you, Mayor. I should agree with Councilmember Cohen, Councilmember Lim, Councilmember Anderson, that this should move forward, and I don't necessarily see them as exactly intertwined as mentioned by staff, but they do kind of coincide together. We have been talking about this, at least some of the council members that are returning for over a year. For those of us new, we just kind of have to jump in with it. And as mentioned by Attorney Rogers, we aren't bound by making this decision tonight. We can always table it. We can always change the setbacks, especially since second reading is occurring after our session we're having on March 1st. And I also am of the opinion that just because you have the land up there, and I know the size of the setbacks is a concern for maybe a couple of council members. Just because you have that land available doesn't necessarily mean it is wise to develop on it. As I sent out that lovely YouTube video earlier in the week about urban sprawl and how it affects city budgets. That does add extra expenses when we start widening the city. And the more infill development is better than continuing to spread outward. So that's my only comment I have to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lindsay.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to start by answering Councilmember Cohen's question, which, I think the answer is we don't know. So we don't have a study session. And, I have real concerns, and I wasn't going to delve into the actual meat of the issue, but I guess that's what we're doing now. But, do we really, is the best tool in the toolbox to empower the operators of these wells to control what happens in the land around them? Is that the best tool we have to do this? Because I think there might be a better way to do this without empowering the oil and gas companies that are drilling this land to determine what happens around them. And I think maybe we should have a discussion about assurances and see if there's a better tool. Maybe it's another, I like to use the toolbox metaphor here. Maybe it's another hammer like this regulation is. Maybe it's a screwdriver. I don't know. But I think we need to have that discussion because from a health and safety perspective, I don't want anyone living next to these wells. And from a climate perspective, I want these things PMA tomorrow. But what this is going to do right now is empower the owners of those wells to hold developers essentially hostage to develop their land. And I don't know if this is the right way to do it. I really don't. I might support this, I might not. I'm not sold either way, but I really want to have that other discussion first because I think it's really premature until I know what financial assurances mean and what other tools we have to get this done. So thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. And technically it wouldn't happen on first reading vote. The tool.
I would like to do it at the same time.
I hear you.
I stand by that.
Right on. Councilmember Engel.
Thank you, Mayor. To sort of piggyback on Councilmember Lindsay, and this is we talk a lot about unintended consequences, and I really think we are giving the oil and gas industry a huge amount of power in these situations. Secondly, I take my first reading vote actually very seriously. And those votes are important. If we didn't have those first reading votes and it's just here to check the boxes off, why even have a first reading? And I think the first reading is, yes, are we trying to get the glitches out, those sorts of things, but we have new council members here that have said, I need to actually understand even the different parts of development of oil and gas development. And I think we need to really care for our fellow council members as well in this process, and also understanding the CDPHE report, which does not give 500-foot setbacks for this stage in development. We need to be very clear about that. And so could it hurt us to rush through this? I know people say we've been talking about this for a year. We have not been talking about this specific part of the development, though. I want to make that very clear to everyone. We have been talking about this for a short amount of time during this part of the development. And rushing through it without having what we requested, I feel we're going back on what we requested, which seems very confusing to the public, to me. It seems very misleading. And I'm thankful for the staff, moving this forward because, we had talked about setbacks for so long. But to just say, we just need to move it on because we've been talking about it for a year, does no one any favors. It doesn't do our fellow council members who need more education on this subject any favors. And it doesn't do our public who we owe our time and our efforts to. Otherwise, it's just sloppy policy work, to be honest with you. And I really would like to request our council members or fellow council members to move forward in a very methodical way. I don't know why we would, what's the rush? So thank you.
Councilmember Marshall.
Thank you, Mayor. So I've been going back and forth on how I wanted to vote on the motion to table. And I think it comes down to what Councilmember Wood said, Councilmember Hinkle just said. This is my fear is that we're empowering the the oil and gas operator to hold the developer hostage, like Councilmember Linson said. I want to make sure that we do everything we possibly can to hold the operators accountable and make them clean up their mess and not let them get away with it by pushing costs onto a developer. So at this, I'm going to support the motion to table. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion on the Councilmember Anderson?
So I'm a little confused by how a reverse setback is empowering the operators. If we're putting a reverse setback in, we're saying this is a safety precaution, following Davis 43.6, and we're still doing the soil gas testing program. We're still locating wells and taking that precautionary step to put a 500-foot setback in place. While at the same time, simultaneously, and this is something that I've been speaking of for a long time, is this need to plug and abandon these wells. That's the incentive. The 500-foot setback or whatever number we land on is the safety precaution. So I don't see these two as being as married as others do. I just think that we need to go ahead and put these reverse setbacks in place like we have been planning on. And if we can find through the financial assurance as a way to incentivize the operators to plug and abandon the wells, or what we need to do, we have a lot of shut-in wells that are that aren't getting any closer to being abandoned, and that is a serious discussion we have to have. But in the meantime, we also need to make sure we have a setback. Those are two separate things. So I will be voting to go ahead with our discussion as planned tonight and pass this on first reading. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Jezierski.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to be brief. I am not necessarily against the setbacks at all, particularly in the instance of the large horizontal packs. But having said that, I do want to. I'd love to have the discussion first on these financial assurances before we make any decisions. As Councilmember Henkel mentioned, I do think even though this is only a first vote, and of course we can change things down the road. I think we all take the first vote seriously. I don't think anyone's going to take a vote on anything, even on first reading, and vote yes if they're against it, at least specifically significantly against it. So I think we all take these votes seriously, and I think it'd be difficult for me to vote without at least hearing this discussion on the financial assurances. So I would still like to have these discussions, concurrently. I think these are, as Councilmember Cohen mentioned, maybe apples and oranges, galas and McIntosh, or however that was phrased. These are both tools that I think they're trying to achieve the same goal. I think they're trying to make our community safer for our residents. There are two different ways of doing that. One is the setback way, and the other one is to provide incentives to give the producers to take action and make them safe for themselves. So I think the ultimate goal is the same, these are just two different ways of getting there, and I think we need to have those discussions in tandem.
Councilmember Shaw?
Thank you, Mayor. Attorney Rogers, you had mentioned that the reverse setbacks wouldn't apply to already approved projects. However, we've had a little bit of conversation around financial assurances. So without getting into that conversation too much, would the financial assurances apply to current operators, or is that going to be only on new operators?
It would apply to all operators except extraction.
Right. And then what about shut-in wells or wells that have an operator that's gone bankrupt that we can't find? With those financial assurances tied to that well, or are they going to tie to the operator?
I'll have to defer that question for our discussion. We don't have Mike Foot here. He's the one that's been working on the proposed order. But our intent is to make it as broadly applicable as possible.
Councilmember Schaaf, if I may just quickly, the abandoned, the orphan wells, where you don't have that direct tie, those are, we have, and Mr. Valdez is in the audience, but we spent a lot of time talking about those with the, on the inspection program. So we have 4 wells that fit into that category of plugged, abandoned, and orphaned, so that there isn't a direct tie. Those 4 wells, we're working with the COGCC to get them on the list that Civitas/Extraction has worked with COGCC to plug and abandon those wells that are in their orphan well program.
Just a clarification. So the orphan wells are not plugged and abandoned.
They are plugged and abandoned? Oh, I'm sorry, they are not. And Mr. Valdez, just clarify that real quick for us, please, and clarify those 4, please.
Yeah, so Councilmember Schaaf, so there's only 4, this isn't like a widespread problem unique to Broomfield, it's just 4 wells, 1 defunct operator, and they're already all on the COGCC's radar. They're all shut in or temporarily abandoned. They're not plugged and abandoned yet. So we're trying to work with our operator to incentivize them to plug and abandon those for us.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Appreciate it. So I think that, that where I am is that, we've had this conversation in a study session where there was a vast amount of information regarding the reverse setbacks for these wells. We talked about production wells, what that meant. We have tonight's discussion to continue that conversation regarding reverse setbacks. I would be in favor of continuing that conversation around this ordinance, passing it on, moving toward first reading, as opposed to delaying this conversation. I think that, as we move toward the financial assurances, we can find out if that's another apple type or if it's an orange. But I do believe that that's going to potentially provide us another tool. But at this point, we don't know all the ins and outs. But we have to continue to move forward, and I think this way we continue to move forward with this. But it's not locking us into this decision tonight. So I'm not going to support this motion to the table.
All right, thank you. Any other discussion? All right, then we're going to go ahead and vote on the amendment to table to April 12th for first reading and May 10th to second reading concurrent with the financial assurance. So I guess all in favor of that amendment? All right. Opposed? Let's do a roll call. Anderson?
No.
Cohen?
No.
Hinkle?
Yes.
Deserves?
Yes.
Leslie?
Yes.
Lim?
No.
Lindstedt?
Yes.
Marshall?
Yes.
Schaaf?
No.
Ward?
No.
Well, that's a tie. And I vote no. So back to the motion. We go to ordinance 2178. Will the clerk please read proposed ordinance number 2178 by title?
Ordinance number 2178, amending certain sections of Title 16 of the Broomfield Municipal Code relating to reverse setbacks for residential land uses for producing and shut-in oil, gas facilities and notification requirements. First reading.
Thank you. Is there a motion? Councilmember Ward,
So moved.
is there a second? Councilmember Shah. Thank you.
Second.
Is there any discussion? Councilmember Marshall.
I'd like to offer a friendly amendment that the second reading be postponed to the April 12th date. Is that how it works?
That's not, we're not at second reading yet, so a motion to postpone second reading.
We're set second reading.
Yeah. It's not, no, it's actually a motion to postpone. It doesn't change the underlying motion that's on the floor for council right now. But if council would like to consider it at this time, council could, since the postponement discussion is so fresh in your memory.
Didn't we just vote on postpone it and vote it down?
No, not postpone the first reading. Pass it on first reading, but postpone second reading until it is concurrent with the financial services meeting.
It would be an amendment to the motion that was just made to change the date.
Right. If I understand what Councilmember Marshall is suggesting, it's a brand new motion, different from the motion that just died. It's a new motion to postpone second reading.
Would that be an amendment that requires 2/3?
No, it's a procedural motion that can be introduced by council at any time.
Well, is there a second? So to restate this, you're proposing that we change second reading to May 10th?
No, pass this on first reading. Have second reading on the April 12th date when we do first reading on the financial assurances.
Okay, just to be clear. So is there a second to this?
I have a procedural question though, because we haven't even passed first reading, so why are we talking about second?
This would be contingent on it passing second reading. Assuming there is a second reading, the motion would be motion to postpone second reading to April 12th. If this passes, contingent on passage.
In just a minute
What?
for the first reading, right?
I do think council, because we did the first motion to postpone, it at the very start of deliberation, it sounds like there's potentially still a lot of deliberation on first reading.
All right, so we have the motion. Second by Councilmember Linston. Any discussion? Councilmember Shah?
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify that the motion, the substitute motion, which would be that ordinance number 2178 be adopted on first reading and order published in full, and then a public hearing and second reading of the ordinance be held on April 12th, 2022. Is that correct?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I apologize. My mistake. That was my mistake. That is the motion. I apologize. I see what you were trying to do, Councilmember Marshall, and what you were saying, Manager Hoffman. Because that typically is how we read our motions here on first reading to second reading.
So Councilmember Schaaf, yes. To your question that you just asked? Yes.
Thanks. I support that. That's fine.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All in favor? You're making this so hard.
So let's, yes, so second reading will be heard on April 12th. The same night that we will hear financial assurances first reading. And we'll make sure that the order is the correct order of having no fruits. We're not gonna have any fruits on that agenda that evening. Yes, so we'll have the second reading first. We'll have the assurances first reading first. based on this conversation, because it will influence, impact to varying degrees what the discussion and decision is for the second reading on this issue.
All right, so we have a motion and a second for that. And so let's do a roll call vote. Because I can't do the can count right now.
Yes.
Yes.
Just clarify once again, because I'm disagreement or not disagreement, unclarity on our, it's not a real word, I don't think.
Second reading for setbacks will be on April 12th.
Right, that's all we're voting now. We're not voting on whether or not to pass this on first reading. Is that what, I mean, is that part of the vote right now? So, that hasn't cleared up people over here.
So, yeah, okay. So,
I don't like the looks on those faces either, because you look surprised.
so procedure, so the mayor just broke the tie.
Broke the tie. So first reading is going to happen tonight. What Councilmember Marshall has done is made a motion to amend the underlying motion to change the date. All you're voting on right now is to change that date for second reading from the 29th of March to April 12th. And then you go back to the substantive discussion on, do we approve the underlying, the substantive?
On first reading, okay. Yes.
That's okay. Leslie,
Yes.
Lim,
Yes.
Lindstedt,
Yes.
Marshall,
Yes.
Schaff,
Yes.
Ward,
Yes.
Anderson.
Yes.
All right, that passes unanimously. So let's go back to the vote, the regular vote for ordinance 2178. Oh, I guess we're doing discussion. Okay. Anyone? What? No. The public comment period passed. On this, that was before, yeah, we don't have to go back to public. But go ahead, Council Member Leslie.
Thank you, Mayor. One of the reasons that I supported the initial motion to kind of bring the two together is because I'm looking for those other tools we might use to try to shut down as many of these wells as we possibly can. Partly because my big issue is around safety and consistency. And so, and some of my fellow council members have heard me talk about my concern that we have a different standard for the same thing. Now, if I'm to understand, we have the council has set a 2,000 foot distance for homes, for wells to be drilled close to homes or schools or whatever. And in this instance, we're talking about existing wells and how close can we build a house to those wells. And it seems to me that the standard of health doesn't change, whether you have the well first or the house first. So that's my struggle, is why would we have a different standard when we have the same issue, a person's health? That's number one. Number two, I worry that homes that might be built closer to wells might be less expensive and therefore more affordable to people who we are looking to provide more affordable housing to. And those individuals are often in categories that are often negatively affected by environmental and other related issues. So I'm concerned about that. Third, I do acknowledge that there may be a difference if a well is secured and safe and not, I'm going to say this politely, not passing gas, and providing no danger to the potential residents of that area. But we also know that wells can continue to provide fumes and other issues long after they've been capped and retired. So this is not so simple as if the well is capped, it's 500 feet. If the well's not capped, it's 2,000 feet or whatever. Okay, so that's my struggle. So I just wanted my colleagues here to understand that. I'm still struggling with the 500 foot. I understand, I thought you guys did a nice job of explaining how you came up with those numbers. You did not have a consensus. You had to put something on the table. I'm still struggling with that. A football field is 360 feet long. It's not a lot of distance. 500 feet is actually, the gap between that 360 and the 500 is the width of a football field, 160 feet. So you're talking about not a very big distance between a home, potentially, if we build that close, and a well. Now, if we would agree that a secured well continuing to be monitored, we could reduce the distance from the well to the new house. That might be something that would help me better support this. But I just don't think 500 feet is far enough. That's my, whether it's vertical or whether it's horizontal or whatever else. These are environmental negating factors that affect the health and well-being of people, and I just want to try to minimize that, whether it's in an existing home or a new home. So that's my struggle. So I'm going to listen carefully. I want to hear what my colleagues have to say, but that's where I am right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tim.
Councilmember Lizzie, if I may, all of those points are exactly why we continue to have these conversations, because it is that complexity of the various stages of development. It's one of the reasons, the core reasons that we implemented. We're the only community that has an inspection program. The wells are inspected quarterly. Which is why we found the Davis 43 well. So it wasn't by chance that we found that. The same complexity adds to the development, right? So the site development plans, vested rights. It's complex. And I'm hoping as we continue the conversation that we are able to provide data that leads to a decision-making matrix, because we certainly haven't discovered what that secret key is.
Thank you, Ms. Hoffman. And a question we should probably include for this financial assurances discussion is how many of these operators are now defunct? How many have just disappeared? That they will never, even if there was a financial assurances obligation, be found to pay those or to, be obligated because they've left these wells all over the state. They're gone. So to get some data on that and how financial assurances sound great, but when we're talking about these legacy wells, these historical shut-ins and just junk sitting around, there's nobody around that's ever going to have to accept the tax rate.
And so we have a good sense of that. And so we have 4 of those that fit into that category right now. That again, we're continuing to get it on the master list at COGCC. So with
Has no money.
Well, and so the deal between, and this is outside of Broomfield, but Civitas and Extraction have made a deal with the COGCC to come and pick up the cost to plug and abandon those wells that are on the, I was going to say stepchild, but that is not the, what's the, I'm sorry, the orphan, the orphan well program. So again, it's a much bigger issue. Again, everything is relative. So 4 may not seem like it's a huge number. It's a huge number for us, given that it's $100,000 per well to have this happen and then add to our inspections. We're confident, and I'm going on the record now, that we're going to be able to get those 4 on the COGCC's orphan well list, which will then fall into the agreement that Civitas and Extraction will, those additional 4 wells will also be in that plugged and abandoned over the next 24 months to be completed on their dime. So that's an outside agreement that they have and that they've already agreed to with COGCC. We just didn't have our 4 wells on that list yet. So then we made, well, we called them immediately and said, they're not on there, but they're going to be. So plan on 4 more.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Marshall.
Thank you, Mayor. One quick question. Are we in just questions now, or are we in comments too?
Discussion.
So I have one question first. The notification requirements that are in the ordinance, what wells do those apply to? Does it apply to plug and abandoned wells too, or just the 500 and 2,000 foot wells?
Britton said he's going to take that question.
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify that. As written, the notification requirements included in this ordinance would not apply to plugged and abandoned wells. It's just the producing, shut-in, or pre-production facilities.
Okay, that's what I thought the way I was reading it. So I probably will offer amendment on second reading to apply them to all plug and abandoned wells also. So my thoughts on this, I see this in 3 parts. 2 which I support completely, 1 of which I have serious concerns about. You know, the 2,000 foot setback against horizontal wells with big pads, I absolutely support that. Because those aren't going away anytime soon. The notice requirements, as I said during study session, I think there is not an amount of transparency. Notice that it's too much. So I fully support that. My problem is with the 500 foot setback, and not because I don't think it's important to have a setback from these oil and gas wells. I absolutely do. Safety is paramount. My issue with it is that, as was stated before, is that to me, it puts the pressure on the developer to come in and pay to plug in and abandon the well. Because we're saying it's not to me, it's not as much a safety regulation as it is the incentive to get these things plugged and abandoned. The big ones, the extraction pads, those are not going to be plugged and abandoned in the next lifetime or whatever. But these ones that are non-producing need to be plugged and abandoned now. And to me, the 500 foot setback is just putting it on the developer to come in and pay the money to do it. And whereas the money should be paid by the operator. And that's my problem with that particular part of this ordinance. It's important, the health and safety is important, we must have it. I just want the operators to pay to clean up their mess, not the developers to have to do it. It's already expensive enough to build a Broomfield. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of my thoughts on this particular, so that's it for now, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Lindstedt.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I'm in a very similar place to Councilmember Marshall. 95% of this ordinance I agree with. I think it definitely, protects health and safety. We absolutely should not have homes near the extraction pads. All the notice requirements are great. And that's why I'm so frustrated that we're here tonight, trying to figure out what to do with not the 4 abandoned wells, not the 4 orphan wells, but the single vertical wells that are privately held. Those are what I'm concerned about. Ms. Rogers or staff, or I don't know who would know the answer to this. If one of the private company that holds one of those wells was approached by a developer, and that developer wanted to build within that 250 to 500 foot setback, that would require that well to be P&A'd. Could they ask that developer for more money than it would cost to P&A that well? Or could they basically ask for a payoff to allow them to P&A that well under this ordinance?
I think I'll quickly jump into that question, only because we have had some experience with developers having just that experience. It is not necessarily just the cost of plugging and abandoning, but also an additional financial cost for that plugging and abandoning for the operator. So it is often more than just that. That is just the physical cost of plugging and abandoning.
So the oil and gas company can collect a nice fat check from the developer who wants to build here, and then finally P&A the well because of the setback. That's something that has occurred and would continue occurring under these rules.
It's something that has occurred. I wouldn't go as far as saying that they got more money than it would cost to do it.
Do the P&A.
Yeah, I mean, again, our developers in Broomfield have been,
The developers don't have the power here.
well, the The ones that we know that Anna is speaking to that have happened even in the last 2 years from the two developers that approached them and plugged and abandoned, not just one, right, but up to 10 on their dime. They did it because they are, I mean, again, the end goal is they want to be able to develop. But additionally, we didn't have to ask them to do that. I mean, both of those.
I'm talking about two separate entities. I'm talking about the owner of the well and the developer.
Yeah.
And want to build. So that relationship is what I'm concerned about, and the leveraging of these setbacks towards the owners of those wells, or the companies or private owners, whoever it is. So that's the question, and I think Nancy, did you have something to say? So that's been my concern. That is my concern. 96% of this ordinance is great, and it's good, and it's going to be effective, but I really worry about that. And of course, I'm not going to vote against it because, you know, the rest of the ordinance is a good thing. But I really, really think that the process to get to this point was rushed. The process during marijuana really, really bothered me. And I got to this point, and the direction from that study session was not what was in this ordinance. And it bothers me that we're here. It bothers me that we couldn't delay and have that conversation. I think it was a failure to get to this point where now I am on a first reading vote, having to vote for something that I don't completely understand, that 4% of this. And it's just, I think we could have done this better as a body. So I'm really disappointed. That's how that's how we got here. I don't think the process was followed. And I don't think the direction from that study session was completed, because I really wanted to have that financial assurances discussion because of that one small part of this ordinance about those vertical wells. So I'm hoping on second reading, my hope is restored a little bit, but right now I'll be a yes vote, of course, because the vast majority of this ordinance I think is good, but I have real concerns about those vertical wells that are not orphan wells. So thank you. That's all I have, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Linson, and you definitely, have time to organize an amendment for the second reading, which anybody could have done for this as well. So that's always out there for any council member. Next is Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor. I too I support, the 2,000 foot setbacks for mainly for a lot of those wells that are together in those mega pads. I will say that during the study session, both Councilmember Leslie and I had asked for, hey, if we land on a number, what does that number look like and why? And what studies are supporting it? And so can staff tell me what studies are supporting the 500 feet?
I think we're all over, yeah. Dr. Weisner.
We won't all jump at once to answer that tricky question. As I've stated before, the vast majority of the studies that I've reviewed don't have setback distances that are based on health and safety. They're political compromises, which makes this such a challenging situation. I am not aware of any, off the top of my head, and I could get back to you on this, any health and safety data studies that point to a specific number for reverse setbacks. I have not come across any for this particular unique situation that we're in, but I can do more research.
Councilmember Hinkle, too, again, from, so the data on reverse setbacks is very different than data on general setbacks. So, Dr. Weidner, before you sit down, please clarify the 2,000 foot CDPHE setback was based on what?
The 2,000-foot setback that CDPHE came up with was based on the 2019 Human Health Risk Assessment, where they looked at modeled data. They did not look at actual symptoms. They looked at modeled air emissions data, and they found there were certain phases of oil and gas activity that produced a higher amount of emissions, like drilling and flowback, which could affect human health up to 2,000 feet. And that's what that number was based on.
So again, it's if there was something tangible that we could put together to help you all make that setback decision, we would like nothing more than to be able to provide that.
Thank you. Yeah, I did read the CDPHE report a couple of years ago, and in fact, a lot of the study and analysis actually does not even mention the production part of the stage. So like a lot of the modeling data, it's not even in there. So I think we have to be very, very careful about dissecting this and not using, a sledgehammer or hammer is what Councilmember Lindsay said. I will remind our council too that we tried to pass, a proposition a long time ago, it seems like a long time ago. And there was data supporting a different proposition that would have passed based on health and safety, and we passed that to the legislature. It was very costly for us to do a 2,500-foot setback. We did not have a lot of buy-in. And we eventually got more local control. We eventually passed things to the legislature, and that got the problem solved. So instead of using a hammer, I would like to dissect this and use this in a very intelligent and methodical way to really solve the actual problem versus just saying a setback is an answer to all of our oil and gas problems, because that's not the answer. Also, Steph, would you mind opening up the map? I believe it's on page 5, where it shows all the purple circles and where these wells are, so that we can all see, particularly the wells in Ward 5 that have yet to be developed in that area. And whoever, either made this map or can answer to this map, I just have a few questions. One of my questions is, what does that distance look like from circle to circle? Because I have it on my recollection that from one side of the well to another side of the entire well is 3 football fields. So when I look at this, I'm looking at 3 football fields in every single circle. So that's the bottom circle, the middle circle, top circle. I'm looking at 3, 6, 9 football fields of space that sure the developer could keep it as open space, but it also could be space that could be used. And so can I just have an answer as to how much space are we actually leaving for the developer? Do we know?
Councilmember, I guess I'm not quite understanding the question, but let me know if I'm not getting there.
Sure.
But I think you're meaning in terms of the east side of I-25 specifically, where we have a lot of adjacent setback areas. So this map and the reverse setback discussion this evening is really only related to the residential uses. That portion of the city has been called out for mixed use development. So it will leave opportunities for other types of development, office, employment focused, commercial, but without the employment element or residential element within those setback areas. The operators themselves will likely have surface use agreements and some clear space available, like you mentioned, the football field type area around each of the well pads that would not be able to be utilized if the well was actually in production. But around that production facility, it could be developed potentially as a non-residential use. Or as you mentioned, open area or open lands associated with an adjacent residential development outside the setback area.
Do we foresee any legal challenges as to how that might affect the property value?
Councilmember, we haven't received any notice or public inquiries of any type that indicates a legal challenge, but it could happen. And I just refer council back to attorney-client privilege memo we have on the legal risk.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I will say that, you know, even if you cook a brownie, you can add a very bad ingredient to this brownie and it can ruin the whole thing. I will not support this tonight, and it's because it's just not properly done. It has not been answering, you know, our questions. We have council members that still have questions about, you know, different parts of development, of oil and gas development. And I just cannot support it. It sends just a very bad message to those people who are in need of affordable housing. And we're gonna have to answer to, why can't I afford, you know, to live here? And we would say, well, we just chose randomly 500 feet setbacks. We didn't have any data for it, but good luck with that. I mean, it's very Broomfield-ish to say, you know, not in my backyard, we don't want, you know, residents here, but we also aren't putting the pressure on oil and gas companies either. So we have to really, really dissect this. We can't just, you know, throw out setbacks out there just haphazardly. We have to really assess, like, what is going to actually solve this problem. And I don't think that this part of this ordinance is going to solve this problem. And it's very concerning to me that we would have to answer to those people who need affordable housing in our areas. And yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Jezierski.
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, I'm gonna start with I have maybe a couple of questions about the issue that Councilmember Lindsted brought up, sort of the problem of the holdout operator. So we have a situation where there's an operator that is sort of holding a developer hostage. I guess that's the way we look at it, and that's happened in the past. I've read those complaints as well. I'm assuming that the developer right now doesn't have much of the authority to just go onto the land and plug and abandon the well themselves. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can we put together some, and I'm just thinking about this here now, can we put together some process that's, I want to compare it to eminent domain, but some kind of process where a developer can make a reasonable offer to an operator and they have to accept it to some extent. I mean, I don't know what the reasonable offer is, but something that prevents them from being the holdout, prevents them from holding the land hostage. Some sort of process, offer acceptance process. I don't know what that would look like really right now, but sort of was thinking of what I was saying here.
Councilmember Jezierski, when we started looking at this, one of the things we looked at were those extortion stories that we're hearing, and if we did have regulatory authority to help those negotiations, but really they are private negotiations between two private parties, the oil and gas operator and the landowner.
And it's not clear to me why we couldn't pass some sort of, because I think we do see this in other areas, why we couldn't pass some sort of a process that they would be required to go through, where they have to be, where an offer is allowed and where there, has to somehow, where there's a limit, I guess, to, maybe limited to their actual costs, whatever the driller operator requests, why can't we cap it? Yeah, and not in a specific number, because we don't know what those numbers are, but like I said, specific to, actual costs or something along those lines, which would prohibit them from doing costs plus, whatever.
I think we get into huge issues of our regulatory authority to mandate that an owner of some asset sell it at a certain price. And that asset here being, or agree to do something at a certain price. I struggle with thinking that we could have that impact on that private commercial transaction. I'm trying to think of.
I'm trying to come up with the way out of this here. You're not helping me.
I know. I don't think
Let's think about it.
Yes, we will.
All right. Okay. Other than that, I do want to address briefly, because I did think about this earlier today, the comment that Councilmember Leslie brought up as to why we would have a different standard for an oil and gas operator who wants to come into our community versus a developer who wants to build next to a well. And for me, it's, those are two different things. One is protecting our citizens from having risks forced upon them. And the other one is, basically taking a citizen's ability to assess and assume the risk themselves. So, here's my thought process for anyone who's still listening. It's not sure as many people, but anyways, I think everyone out here on the dais and our council, agrees that the oil and gas wells, do pose a risk. However, we as a society do choose to take risks every day, whether that's driving our cars, folks who choose to smoke cigarettes, I don't, or folks who decide to eat fatty, delicious barbecue ribs, which I do. Those are all risks. And, it's always been my opinion that, as a government, we should protect, our citizens to the extent possible from having the risks forced upon them. However, I guess we don't force risks upon people, or force citizens to take risks. Again, I think that's what the difference is. We don't force someone to get into a car or take a risk. We don't force someone to smoke, or we force someone to eat barbecue ribs. We let those people, make this choice for themselves. Me personally, I wouldn't want to live next to an oil and gas well, and I don't want to force anyone else to. And that's why we went ahead, months ago and did pass the 2,000-foot setbacks, or a new oil and gas wells. Someone who's already living there, we don't want to force them into that situation. I guess for me though, why we'd have a different standard is, I'm not sure all our citizens would have the same concerns as myself or my colleagues here on council. And I'm not sure I'd want to interchange my judgment for, how they assess that risk any more than I would prohibit someone from taking risks in other instances. So I guess that's sort of my analysis there, that, we don't want to force someone into a risky situation, but I'm not sure it's our responsibility to stop someone if they choose to accept a risky situation. And, that's how I see those two things differently. Having said all that, I am in favor of a lot, as has been mentioned, a lot of what's in this, proposed legislation tonight. As I previously mentioned, we're talking about the horizontal wells and the large well pads that were forced upon us by extraction. Yes, I think we need to have the significant setbacks for those. Where it becomes much more difficult are these individual wells, as we've heard tonight. So, although I don't want to do it, I think I will likely vote in favor of the 500. If that's what we're talking about tonight, but that is something that I'm going to think about significantly over the next few weeks, and we'll see where the discussion next week goes, and other discussions amongst ourselves from there on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lim? We're at the 2 minute, just so you guys know.
This is to staff. Do we have wells in the Northeast that have leaked or had spills? This is my first.
Oh, wait, I lost track. This is a brand new round, so I don't know anymore. We're in unexplored territory, so we're on round 3 of discussions. Do the 5 and 2 still apply every time we open up discussion again? Because I might be wrong.
It does.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Councilmember.
No, 5 minutes. I'm wrong. Well, 5 minutes is fine. My bad. And it was Councilmember Lim.
Okay. So do we have wells in the Northeast section that we were looking at east of I-25 that have had leaks and spills?
Yeah, so short answer, yes, we have had minor findings in a lot of these old vertical wells, usually limited to some ground staining, things like that, leaking tanks, stuff like that.
Okay.
Those that have operators have remedied the problems quickly.
So I do consider 500 feet a political compromise. I recognize that we have to have a political compromise here. 500 feet is not what I started out thinking, believe me, for these vertical wells. You can go back and listen to council meetings to see that that was the case. So this 500 feet is a compromise. We have to protect the health and safety of residents who would live within 500 feet otherwise of those vertical wells. I don't want anybody in any housing living within 500 feet of those vertical wells. It's not safe. We have our own data that these things leak. And we can put, as Ms. Bergenzetti said, we can put something else up there in the Northeast. We can put commercial. We can put open space, but we need to get that Northeast section is a long-term proposition for a developer. It's not a one-off kind of thing. You're gonna, at least in my mind, it's gonna be someone who has the funds to put in the infrastructure. There's a lot of work that needs to be in that Northeast section. It's not gonna be some little independent developer who doesn't have any clout against an operator to get those wells plugged and abandoned. If a developer wants to, it's gonna be somebody who has a lot of wherewithal and funding to put that, to really develop that area, and it's going to be a long-term proposition. So in the meantime, I have to go with what I know needs to be done to protect the health and safety of residents. And it can't be 2,000 feet, like it would be for horizontal wells, as in this ordinance, but it is a compromise in my mind to say it can be 500 feet for the vertical legacy wells. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson?
Thank you, and I will keep it short.
No, you have 5 minutes.
Oh, I don't need 5 minutes. So I just want to, just kind of, just as we're taking these notes, to note that I do support, Councilmember Leslie brought up the possibility of increasing that 500-foot setback to something greater. And my only thought here is that I would be, I also agree with Councilmember Lim that this is a political compromise that we got to 500 feet. And I would actually be in support of a greater distance with some type of precautions in place. We can discuss this, before second reading with the some type of increased monitoring or increased leak detection repair or something. Just keep a close eye on those wells, and then you can maybe get less and do more for a well that's not being watched. That's my thought on that distance. And I know it's not gonna. We're going to not all be at the same number on that because I believe the protection of health and safety that is our responsibility. And we do know that these wells can have issues. I would suggest that we say we don't not have data. Environmental organizations such as Earthworks have plenty of data to show emissions coming off really well. They have their clear cameras that they go out with and they find some. It depends. It depends on who's maintain that well site. There's a great vast difference between old infrastructure that's being maintained versus something that's not being maintained. I also wanted to respond to Councilor Hinkle's mention of SB 181 as if everything was solved with the state. That is really not the case. We do need to do our diligence here locally and pay attention to everything related to oil and gas. And this just for this piece that we're really pointing on tonight, my understanding is that this is where the conversation started tonight. This reverse setback is the piece that protects the health and safety that says you cannot come closer than 500 feet or whatever that distance is. And then that financial assurances conversation is the one that incentivizes. I don't think that protects the health and safety. And is there something that financial assurances that would somehow prevent development within 500 feet or whatever that set number is? That's a separate incentive that is not going to keep developers away, right? Okay. So I firmly stand by passing this ordinance tonight on first reading and then, debating those, last remaining pieces. And that is all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Cohen?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm trying not to be redundant to all the arguments been made, but I wanted to address two things in terms of points made about risk. I think just because you can build something that's unsafe and sell it doesn't absolve you of guilt if someone buys it. I think we have a moral responsibility when we approve housing, that we're approving housing that we know to be safe, to require it to be safe, and that we shouldn't then put the burden on the buyer. I also want to reject the notion that affordable housing should be an issue or something that we can insert to reduce our concerns about safety. Everybody deserves a safe house. And I think it was Councilmember Leslie made the point that people who are often in lower income housing suffer higher effects of environmental damage, and it has lifelong effects. And I don't think that's the legacy we want for the city and county of Broomfield. The last point is more philosophical. I think we all know oil and gas industry has for decades been allowed to profit at the expense of the environment and the community without any recourse, and that continues today. And now we see cities around this area bending over backwards to allow builders to build pretty much wherever they want. And that again takes the hook off oil and gas. Imagine for a minute if all the communities in the range adopted 2000 setbacks. The political equation would change rapidly, and the housing industry would be in there telling the state to make the oil and gas industry pay and clean it up so they can build. I don't feel like we're any under obligation because you invested in land with oil wells that we have give you a buy and let you build there because you made that investment. That's part of the risk. I think our obligation is to ensure that anything that's built there is safe and no one suffers the consequences for lack of knowledge if they buy that home.
Thank you. I'm going to Councilmember Ward next because he hasn't gone for a first round. Councilmember Ward, 5 minutes. No, not on this cycle. On my list anyway.
I keep losing track of where we are, so okay. Really all I wanted to discuss or say is kind of hopefully expand on what Councilmember Cohen said with regard to where we place developments and just because we can doesn't mean we should. Our job not only is to protect the health and safety of our residents, but really is to protect the most vulnerable, especially there to protect the most vulnerable of our communities. And as mentioned by Councilmember Cohen and Councilmember Leslie, that tends to be our minority communities, our African American, Latinx communities. And oftentimes, when you are financially struggling, as many people are, you make trade-offs, especially with regard to your health. And we've seen that, especially with our broken healthcare system. You put off going to the doctor, making certain checkups, or getting things checked out, all in the name of saving a dollar. And by putting potentially affordable housing in an area that is clustered with shut-in and producing wells, I think is a slap in the face to those communities who we are there to protect. That's really all I have to say.
Thank you. We'll go to second round now. Councilmember Marshall.
Thank you, Mayor. So question for the attorneys. I am by no means, going off of what Councilmember Jasinski mentioned, I'm by no means an expert in eminent domain, and property law class was 12 years ago. But isn't there some way that we could use eminent domain, for example, to force them to plug and abandon the wells, the operators, I mean, rather than pushing the cost onto the developers?
Fortunately, we do have an expert in eminent domain on staff. It's something that Pat Gilbert has done for many years. So I'm going to turn that question over to Deputy City and County Attorney Pat Gilbert.
It's a tricky question because what we're talking about in terms is between the developer and the oil and gas operator, and neither of them have the power of eminent domain. The government does. And so we would have to take it over for a public purpose. So it's hard. I struggle with what that public purpose would be.
Health and safety?
Then you have to have the science and data, and this is kind of moving into what might be a better executive session discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Marshall,
And you are on the 2 minute
Yeah.
clock, just saying.
we've never utilized eminent domain in the city and county of Broomfield. So that would also have to be, and so from a public good perspective, to then have a developer be a beneficiary of once we've executed eminent domain is another thing that we would.
I remember the Supreme Court rule on that years ago, but then I'm sure a lot of things have changed since then, so. Okay. I'm struggling with this one because, as I said before, I agree with 2 of the 3 points in this. And I do take Councilor Cohen's point that if all of the communities bound together, we could possibly force the oil and gas hand, the developer's hand. My struggle, of course, is that the likelihood of that happening is not short term. I support health and safety above all else, but I don't support giving the oil operators a free pass. And I believe the 500 setback is that. I mean, I know this is going to pass on first reading, and I probably will support it on second reading, but I think I'm going to oppose it on first reading because I just can't. I can't give a pass to the oil and gas operators, and that's what I believe the 500 foot setback part is. So, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Hinkle.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for the discussion. I really appreciate, everyone kind of dissecting through this. I do want to clarify certain things, and it's particularly the language that we're using on council as well. I think all of us want these wells plugged into the end. I think we all have this very same end game. We are just very much disagreeing on how to get there. And I think the reason why, and in fact, I know the reason why I mentioned SB 181, I didn't say that it solved all of our problems, but I will say we had that language already sort of pre-approved as a proposition that would have passed much easier, and we had the data to do so. Would that have helped the situation? Yes. And it was just a different methodology. So when we talk about setbacks, there's different methodologies that would pass because we have more buy-in. We have more buy-in from developers. We would have more buy-in from the oil and gas industry. We do have to work with both. And I really want to be just really careful about, how we go about this. It's also, I feel like it's just disingenuous to say that a closer setback isn't protecting health and safety. I think, if we're going to wax poetic about health and safety, then we need to take a look at the way oil and gas is used. Do we really want to protect health and safety? Should we start using setbacks for cars and where they're being used? Should we start setbacks, for gas stations? These are just real logistical, holistic questions. Are we going to do setbacks for, plastics? What are we going to do? What are we going to do about this oil and gas, this fossil fuel industry? The setbacks would only answer this sort of, view of, can we be viewed as really protecting health and safety? And while I'm here to be a hero for health and safety, I think all of us are, I think we have to be really wise about how we're going to be doing this. We can protect to the point though, where we have no affordable housing anywhere. And I think we have to really look at the actual data. And it's very frustrating for me with a biology degree to say, oh, we're just going to throw, at the dartboard and just choose 500. Meanwhile, we have real needs in our community that if we can still protect health and safety, maybe even at the 300 foot mark, we're still protecting health and safety. And I really don't want to discount anyone who would appreciate, that distance of a setback, because you could still have that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Shah.
Thank you, Mayor. So thanks to staff for the clarity on the setback distance and how that came up. I went back and reviewed the study session today myself and noticed that 500 was mentioned multiple times by multiple council members. So and having a greater setback for the larger well pad sites as well. So I do think that staff did get direction there. I don't think that everybody supported those distances, just like we're hearing tonight. But I do think that we have data that support a setback on producing wells. We had this conversation when we were talking about P&A wells, that it takes a minimum space of 250 by 250 foot space to P&A well. So we know that that's kind of a minimum in which we're working with on that setback. Within that space, so this is beyond just the P&A well, within that space, while a well's in production, there's truck noise, there's light pollution, and it remains a 24/7 operation, in which operations can happen at any point in the day. It's not just during, kind of the work hours, which is company. So there is work happening, and we don't have to look any further than the Carson well that's located near the Aspen Creek School. This was a well that I heard about when I ran for office in 2017, and it just recently became plugged and abandoned. Those homeowners were told that that well would be plugged and abandoned within 2 to 3 years after they moved into their house. Many years later, that well finally was plugged and abandoned. But in that interim time, it remained a 24/7 operation. At any moment, there was truck noise out there was light out there, and it happened without any type of notice. So that extra 250 foot distance beyond that distance, that kind of minimum distance we need to that 500 reduces those impacts for those residential units that are within the oil and gas wells and near that site. So I don't think that the 500 foot setback necessarily addresses the health and safety that we continue to talk about, and perhaps it should be increased, as Councilmember Leslie suggests. But the 500 foot setback is where a majority is an agreement, and it is a political compromise, as someone said. But it's what I think that we can get done tonight, and I believe that we should continue to move this forward, because we do have the data to suggest that there is a minimum, and we do understand those impacts beyond that minimum. That's all I have. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Leslie?
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate Dr. Weisner's comments and really would hope that you could do a little bit more, a lot more, whatever it takes to find that magic bullet, to find something that we could build from, because right now we're all over the place. And again, I think Councilmember Lem's comment that this is a political decision, so we're throwing numbers around, and what feels good is what we might settle on, whether it's 500 or something else. So I'd like to offer 1,000 foot setback as kind of my number. It's my political compromise. But I would hope that anything that would help us kind of get around this, frankly, if there was data that said there is no health risk beyond 100 feet, then fine, let's go 100 feet. But we don't have that. That's our dilemma right now. So I'm really struggling with the idea that we approve this, and then in the second round, we make changes, because I don't know if those changes might be made or not. I've heard a couple of my colleagues say they're not going to support it tonight. But I really want to be able to go back to our constituents, and be able to say, we have some data that, and I don't mean to put all this on you, Dr. Weiser, but we have something here that we built from. And if there was some scientist somewhere, maybe that could give us a foundation upon which we could all come to that compromise, which makes more sense than, quote, 500 feet, or Leslie's 1,000 feet. That's what I'm struggling with. Okay. I think we're all in agreement about the 2,000 per wells. It sounds like there's consensus there. It's the rest of the wells. And again, I appreciate my colleagues acknowledging that we do have an obligation to be thoughtful about where affordable housing might go, again, for the reasons that I've already stated. But it's not just that. It's even if those houses closer to wells were not any less expensive. That's still all the other points, the light, the noise, the sound, the trucks, the construction, the damage to the roads. We haven't even talked about that. We talked about that with garbage trucks going up and down. But I know firsthand from all the drilling taking place in Texas, that became a huge, huge issue, that the roads were being destroyed. And so neighborhood roads would be deteriorated more rapidly, on and on and on. So I just would love to see something that we could build from, and right now I don't feel we have that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor, if I may do that, again, from the perspective of setting these expectations about what we're going to be able to deliver when we come back. We aren't going to be able, I mean, we've been looking and looking and looking and looking. So I don't want there to be an expectation that Dr. Weiser is going to be able to prove or disprove. Again, the CDPHE 2,000 foot setback was based on a model, wasn't based on data. It wasn't based on something that you could look at. And again, there's still continued dialogue about it's only modeling. It wasn't data. So when you're talking about reverse setbacks, that's going to be even more difficult when we can't even find. And again, there's studies in Oklahoma. There's studies in California. There's policy decisions that were made based on data that's not specific to Colorado that have influenced that decision. Whether you translate that into political conversation or dialogue or not, but I just want to make sure that when we come back, essentially from a data-driven perspective, Councilmember Leslie, we're going to be about the same place that we are right now. So it's more of a philosophical approach. The last thing that I'll say on affordable housing is no one approves affordable housing but you, this council. So regardless of what the setbacks are or aren't, or the reverse setbacks are or aren't, so we already know for the new housing, it's 2,000 feet for residential. On this reverse setbacks, you all as a body will determine when we get those applications in for housing, whether you all deem that appropriate or not. So affordable housing is not a given now, nor will it be in the future.
Good, thank you. And I just want to say, Dr. Weisner, I don't mean to put you on the spot. You're the scientist in the room, and so you have some skills that many of us don't have to potentially find something. I'm wondering to city manager whether there might be, out those points you just made about Oklahoma, California, wherever, whether there were political decisions that are consistent that we could look to and say, well, okay, this is what they do in the majority of areas similar to what we're doing, and so maybe that's the place for us to start.
It's a fantastic question, and one of which it depends on whom you ask in that state. So if you have pro oil and gas, those interpretations of the same study is going to be vastly different than those that are opposed to oil and gas. So again,
but the policy, if there is a policy that a legislature had approved, either at state or local level, that might give us something, because the issue of whose interpretation is now gone, because the political decision has now already been made.
And again, so I'll point to tangible examples of legislation last year, which is the legislation that is passed based on the same data in Texas is very similar to the legislation and data passed in Oklahoma, which is the same data that is used in California, and the outcome looks vastly different.
I understand. And the politics of the states is vastly different too. I understand that.
That's exactly right. So it's hard to find that synthesis, if you will, particularly on reverse setbacks.
Yeah, okay, good, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to speak for a moment and remind people that we have passed regulations and policy based on the precautionary principle. We passed a vaping ordinance based on the precautionary principle. We passed the decision to withdraw from the Jefferson Parkway on the precautionary principle. And that is what most of the oil and gas movement has been about, because we don't know how much harm this is causing. We don't. And I would rather err on the side of caution. That's my personal opinion. I guess we're still doing a couple of second rounds. We'll go to Anderson. Anyone else? You've already done two, sorry.
Thank you.
There's no thirds.
So I appreciate that comment about the precautionary principle because that does come into the discussion when you don't have all the data and you're still collecting the data. But I want to note that this request started as a request to provide reverse setbacks from existing oil and gas operations, and we could certainly look at other setbacks in the future if that's brought forward. But right now we are focused on setbacks from the oil and gas operations. And current setbacks, with one last comment here, the current setbacks from plug and abandoned wells is currently 250 feet. And it's the same for the producing wells. And I'm looking at this a little bit differently than some of my colleagues. If we do not increase the setback for producing wells and it's 250 feet across the board, then there is absolutely no incentive to get these wells plugged and abandoned. And also, Councilor Schaff brought up a good point about the plugging and abandoning of these wells. Every single one of these producing wells, we know there's a known date when it's going to have to, an unknown date. There's a time when it's going to have to plug and abandon. The work over is going to have to come in. There will probably be maintenance activities. So there's that extra piece beyond just the potential for leaks and other safety issues. But once the well is plugged and abandoned, there's no guarantees. But at least you're past that initial plug and abandoned stage. I still think firmly think there has to be a difference. We can debate the 500 feet, but I definitely think we should move this forward to first reading, keep the 500 feet in there, have that final discussion, and just move on, knowing that we have done something additional to protect the health and safety near these wells. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other second round? Guess that ends discussion. Let's go ahead and have our vote on ordinance number 2178 as amended with the April 12th second reading. Let's do a roll call vote. Hinkle?
Sorry, I thought I voted first this time.
No. Jazersky?
Yes.
Leslie?
No.
Lim?
Yes.
Lindstedt?
Yes.
Marsh Holstrom?
No.
Schaff?
Yes.
Ward?
Yes.
Anderson? Yes. Cohen?
Yes.
That passes 7-3. Thank you all for the very informative discussion. More to come. I see noxious weeds back there, so we're going to power through it and take our break right after. Our next order of business on the agenda is the public hearing and council's consideration on second and final reading of proposed ordinance number 2174 concerning a noxious weed management plan. I'll now declare the public hearing open. We'll follow the city's standard public hearing procedures. First, staff will present a summary of the proposal. Next, we will have the applicant's presentation if applicable. Then we'll ask for public comments and finally comments from the applicant, and hopefully not a lot of questions from city council. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, which I'll ask our staff to summarize.
Thank you, Mayor. We sure appreciate it. Clay Shuck is going to walk us through this item, although since it is second reading, it should be at the 50,000 foot level. No obnoxious weed reading. Mr. Shuck.
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, members of City Council. Clay Shuck, Director of Parks, Recreation, and Senior Services. I was going to start out saying that I'm not going to talk about fruit, so we're going to go on to weeds if that's okay. So there was a lot in that memo, and so to be very clear and distinct of what we're asking this evening is approval to pass ordinance number 2174, which defines the local structure for adopting Broomfield County Noxious Weed Management Plan as required by the Colorado Noxious Weed Act. Really, we're asking three things within that ordinance. One is to amend section 2-44 and set the Parks, Recreation, and Senior Services Committee as the Broomfield Noxious Weed Advisory Committee. Additionally, we would be asking to add section 8.45, which requires that City Council adopt a noxious weed management plan with input from the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee. Also, we would add 8-45, which defines the presence of state and locally defined noxious weeds, a nuisance within Broomfield, and permits the abatement of such, as well as define the refusal to comply with Broomfield's notices as orders as a violation of the code. If approved tonight, staff will be taking the management plan back to the Parks, Recreation, and Senior Services Advisory Committee in either March or April for a final review and recommendation. And based upon that recommendation, we would be bringing back the management plan for adoption at a future date to City Council. And that is my summary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schaaf. I just think it's great that you get to add 2 more letters to PROSAC. Well, it's not, and noxious weeds. Parks, Rec, Senior Services, and noxious weeds. Do it all. All right, thank you. We'll now proceed with public comments. Does any member of the public have comments on this agenda item? We'll start with in person. I don't see any online. Questions from council are next. Members should limit themselves to questions during this portion. The time to introduce amendments and state positions for or against this item is later. How much later? I don't know. Are there any questions? Councilmember Lynn.
It was my understanding from reading the memo that we have never, as a city, done any private enforcement on any enforcement on private lands, I should say, of this noxious weed eradication. So will that be part of the management plan that comes before council for our review, for us to look at that enforcement on private lands?
Thank you, Councilmember Lynn, for the question. And yes, it would be. We have not done any eradication on private property. Really, what the adoption of this Colorado Noxious Weed Act does is puts that into play based on what Colorado requires by statute. And if I miss anything, I'm going to turn and look at Courtney, and she gave me the thumbs up. So, yeah, so that's what we would be doing with this, is that we would be able to, on both public land and private property, to do the eradication of at least the noxious weeds presented in the plan.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Councilmember Schaaf.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on that question. So right now, if I have my trailer up for my car sitting out in front of my house, it's a code violation. I can get a warning. Usually it's a warning first, and then a summons after that. So this would be the same, follow the same category, that if someone had noxious weeds growing on their private property, they could potentially have a code violation and a warning, and then a summons at some other point to remove those noxious weeds. Is that correct? That is correct. That is not necessarily how we're going to do it initially. We're going to try to work with the residents, give them plenty of time to try to do the eradication themselves. If it gets to the point where they're failing to comply, that is part of this ordinance on the second one of 8-45, is that we would be then under code allowed to do some enforcement of the municipal code. Great. Well, I appreciate staff's willingness to work with the private landowners, especially as this is a new thing. And as you know, my work with the Rocky Flat Stewardship Council, identifying those noxious weeds isn't the easiest thing. So what's one weed versus another weed that's grown in my backyard. So you know, I appreciate the willingness for staff to work with private landowners. So thank you. That's all I have, ma'am.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councilmember Lindley.
Just curious in terms of city county budget potential impact of this on us, because we will have to take care of our open spaces and other areas where these weeds exist.
We currently, it's budgeted within our open space group that's under Park Services. So Nathan Belby, who is our open space and noxious weed management coordinator, it's part of his role, and that he has been doing since he came to the city and county of Broomfield. So we don't see any additional expenses that we require in this, and our allocated budget and that will be enough to cover those.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, next is council's consideration of proposed ordinance number 2174. Will the clerk please read proposed ordinance number 2174 by title?
Ordinance number 2174, amending chapter 2-44 and adding chapter 8-45 to the Broomfield Municipal Code, requiring the council adopt a noxious weed management plan, second and final reading.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
I'll move it.
Thank you, Councilmember Lindley. Is there a second, Councilmember Shaw? Thank you. Is there any discussion? All right. Is there all in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Congratulations.
Say you had a 50,000-foot setback from noxious weeds. I thought you might apply that to the oil and gas industry.
Oh my goodness. Too much. Well, let's go ahead and take our 10-minute break if y'all are okay with that. We'll come back at 8:26. Thank you. Attorney's report is next. We'll give Ms. Riders a moment so I can ask her and she'll speak. Do you have a report?
No, Mayor, thank
Okay.
you. Thank you all very much.
All right, thank you. The city and county attorney's report is next, Ms. What did I say? Oh goodness, Ms. Hoffman, manager, do you have a report?
I do, just a couple of things, the upcoming council retreat will be focusing on our first budget amendment, which is in April. Council has been so thoughtful and gracious when it comes to our employees. So in April, part of the amendment package is going to be for the adjustment of the salary ranges. We were surprised when we did that review. In years past, we've always had stale data, about a year and a half. We are no longer doing that. We have a new process in place to keep that data relevant and timely. That is going to require, so shifting that and kind of riding that ship is significant financially, but moving forward, it will continue to taper off based on those market adjustments. So we're going to have the market adjustment conversation as well as the merit increase and kind of what that, moving forward on council's compensation philosophy. So we've implemented what the steps are in order to do that. I'm finishing the department heads annual evaluations this week and next week. I can tell you that it's been a while for you all as well, and actually doesn't seem like I've had any time to kind of do what I needed or what I was really good at before getting into the position, and that's kind of that one-on-one face time with the department heads. So it is it's good juice for me and certainly fills my cup, and kind of circling back with them has been really helpful for Abby and I can say. So that will be those the primary purpose of those April meetings. But again, we'll start that introduction conversation at the retreat, and we're excited about that. So once you all look at the agendas, each one of the topic areas, we're continuing to build out specifically what those items are with Ms. Ritchie, so that it's comprehensive, it's not overwhelming. We're trying to again, from the citizens' perspective, we want to be able to put out a package and have those decision-making items in a public arena. And I do have to say, Mayor, so there was no funds spent in 2019, in 2020, or I'm sorry, not 2019, 2020, 2021 on council going or doing anything. So again, it'll be a really good time for all of you to have the FaceTime away from the dais, which is beneficial not only for staff, but certainly for this community. So we're excited about that retreat.
We are too. Thank you so much. All right. Well, there is no, did anybody else have any questions? Not just about me. Okay, cool. There is no legislative update or any business before the Broomfield Urban Renewal Authority or the Arista Local Improvement District Board of Directors this evening, and there are no special reports. The next item for business for council's consideration this evening is Council Member Ward's request for future action regarding amending the Broomfield Municipal Code to address parking maximums versus parking minimums. Before I ask Councilmember Ward to provide a brief summary of the request, 5-minute max, I wanted to remind council that this is not a discussion on the topic, and instead the opportunity for council to provide staff direction on whether or not council desires staff to dedicate time and resources to this request. Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. So as stated, I am looking to amend the Broomfield Municipal Code to change our parking regulations from a minimum number of parking spaces that we set for both residential and commercial to a maximum number of parking spaces we do for both those types of development. The reason for this is partially to address our usage of car infrastructure and the amount of infrastructure or developments taken to place cars where people live and work, trying to make our cities more and more walkable and transit friendly does to a degree mean eliminating some of the car infrastructure we have used so heavily in the past, oh gosh, 80 years since after World War II, which really started developing. So that's kind of my summary. Many places in Europe have already switched to this model, and there are a couple cities that I can't name off the top of my head that have started transitioning to this model. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess we'll ask, does anybody object to moving this forward for further discussion? All right. Are questions allowed? Because then it's going to get into a discussion again like last time. It's like impossible to do this with an up or down, because I get you might have questions and want clarification at this point. So help.
So Mike, if I'm anticipating what those what those questions are. So if I may, Councilmember Ward, on all three of these items, so the cleanup, 2 items. Yes, okay. So part of again it's important for staff to be able to present what's happening before the Section 18As, because all 3 of these items are works in progress. And so as we move forward, especially from the onboarding with the new council folks, kind of what's in that pipeline right now. And so shifting the ordinance really requires additional conversations on the front end, Councilmember Ward, with regards to what the guidelines are that are established on the front end. So same with the EV charging stations, right? So instead of looking at these individually, it's kind of that overall sustainability perspective of how do we build for the future? How are we cognizant of the build once policy, if you will? And how does that relate directly to the number of spaces? So again, it's a comprehensive view that we need to take with regards to development on the front end, and not have the kind of piecemeal on the back end. And we haven't had an opportunity in order to have those conversations on these 3 topic items. It's one of the reasons on sustainability that having Mr. Valdez focus and shift kind of his conversations on sustainability so that we can start having the workshops on what it is that we're working on.
Okay, so should we just take the question? Because I don't even understand.
Well, I think part of it is ACES, right? And I'm sure that's where Councilmember Lim and Councilmember Anderson were going, is based on the policy decisions and input from the ACES committee, how that impacts the overall direction that we're going with regards to sustainability.
Would you like to ask your question, Councilmember?
So could we just maybe keep this to, and this would be a question for Councilor Ward, is I'm not sure that I want to say minimums, but we just keep it a general discussion on the number. I understand we really could maybe use a discussion on parking spaces, but could it be more broad than that? I guess that's my only question is what if the minimum isn't the right thing and we want something, I don't know what.
Well, I mean, the idea is to switch it to parking maximum, so that way developers know if they wanted to go over, they'd have to give a justification as to why they need the extra parking spaces or the extra space for that matter for whatever they're developing. So I'm a little confused as to how to make it more broad, I guess.
The broader conversation, as Jen said, is part of our whole sustainability priority and overhauling a lot of things.
I mean, yes, I do think it should be done in conjunction with, how much do we do for EV chargers and whatnot, but I did it this way just because I wanted to focus on one thing, but it should be, how many EV charging stations do we have per development should be also put into that conversation as well. I mean, my intent with this really was to start the process of doing a major overhaul of the entire municipal code when it comes to development.
Yeah. You're starting young.
Well, that's good, because by the time we finish it,
You're starting at the right time.
season.
Go ahead, Councilmember Lou.
From the perspective of being here a little longer on council, I mean, I have gotten a little notion that staff recognizes that the code for development code needs to be updated. So this doesn't surprise me that your reaction was it's in progress. And also that the sustainability, the ACE's sustainability overall plan in April should present a larger picture. But I do appreciate Councilmember Ward's push here.
Sure.
Because, I mean, again, I have heard, since 2019 that the code is being changed.
Sure.
And we haven't seen that. So I do appreciate his push to move things along. So do you see, I guess, from staff's perspective, do they see it as helpful to bring, pieces of the code forward? Or does it need, can you explain why it needs to be a more comprehensive look at the development code?
A couple of things, and I know we have a lot of staff listening tonight about the code changes. So it has to be comprehensive. If we continue to do piecemeal and not change that basis structure, we're going to be going off in 8 different directions. So I think the major thing from the conversations that started in late 2019, Councilmember Lim, was COVID. So again, having an opportunity to now breathe, and that's part of the retreat that we're planning with regards to the budget and implementations and understanding exactly where we are and the implications of not just the outcome of changing the code, but the time and expenditure of staff time in order to make that happen. So changing that will require additional staffing, whether it's a piecemeal perspective, right? And so again, if we're chasing down, if we're doing a matrix team approach, which moving forward on all of the structure, that's what we're doing. It only makes sense for us to be able to say, and not do the whole code, right? But Pat Gilbert is looking at pieces of the code that are most important that we can size up and execute and that we know we can. So when we're talking about development on the front end, if we are adding, piecemeal got us to that development timeframe now is extremely long. So if we continue to add more stuff to the structure, we don't modify the structure, we have no resiliency. So if we go and we piecemeal those code changes without looking from a comprehensive perspective, and I'm not saying every single piece of it, but again, similar to the work that's been done over the last 18 months, I think all of us except for staff, it was a heavy lift. And so now that we've built the development matrix, which influences that matrix team development, we have our 3 big developments that are occurring. You all approved each one of those. Again, so the lift in order to do that requires more staffing is the bottom line. And more staffing costs. And we need to, as a collective body, prioritize and reallocate those funds. Sustainability is going to drive, so ACES is but one piece, right? So ACES is and so this is for Councilman Marshall as well as Councilmember Ward. ACES, again, is the policy requester that then comes to council for the approval. That is but one piece of the impacts that it has on economic vitality, on public works, on the infrastructure, on almost every single department that we have internally, right? And so again, each one of those decisions, we need as staff to do a better job for council, painting what that picture is, so when you all make decisions development-wise, we understand what that cumulative effect is. So it's part and parcel of the groups moving forward in a particular direction with the vision that we haven't had time in order to make that happen. So when we're talking about what a development looks like and the key components of that development, sustainability, affordable housing, arts and culture, right? I mean, so we've added 3 additional layers to that development in the last 2 years. Part of that sustainability piece, we have to regulate it on the front end so that you all are not making decisions project by project by project. That's where our initial conversation for 2022 and 2023 will land. Will we get to the parking spaces maximum? I don't know. And I don't want to commit to that. I can tell you the developers will be thrilled. Those developers won't be pushing back on us to have more parking.
Thank you. Councilmember Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. So, we've had a lot of philosophy change in the last, 2 years at least. And so I think that, when I saw this request, this is a philosophy change than what we were doing before. And I guess my question would be, is staff open to that philosophy change? Or does this go contrary to staff and really kind of lead down a path of resistance?
I sure appreciate that question, Councilmember Schaaf. It is not for us to judge that, quite frankly, and I don't ever want us or anybody else to be in that role. That's really council direction. Staff's responsibility is to provide council a repeatable process and understand what the decisions, what the impacts are, financially and otherwise, and get away from the piecemeal, the project by project, whether it's development or anything else. We have to be able to provide you all, and that's a shift in philosophy from a staff perspective, from a structure. Building for the future looks very different than building for the now. And a lot of the decisions that were made were building for the now. So the shift requires us, so when we say a collaborative, a cumulative decision-making, part of that starts from a structural perspective where council makes decisions on the front end, right? So we say, okay, and this is an example. I'm not saying this is the direction we're going. I'm simply saying on developments, instead of talking about the hue of the blue that the developer uses, those conversations and agreements have been made on the front end. So again, from a menu of items, right? This is what the architecture looks like. This is the level of landscaping, the aesthetics, if you will. So you agree to those on the front end. Then we build, so we're not moving the field goal with these developers. Because again, they go through concept review after the Affordable Housing Committee, the Sustainability Committee, Public Arts, OSTAC, PRAC. So again, from a structural perspective, the more Councilmember Schaaf that we can bring to council to make decisions on the front end, which that's the development matrix, right? Effectively utilizing that development matrix, because the 34 square miles that we have 26% remaining build out. What we do with that is not only is important, right, but you all will be making decisions for 30 years from now. And what those financial repercussions and implications are. Making the decision on flat irons, right? That was a $20 million decision, $25 million decision to invest in the future of Broomfield. It's $5 million a year. $5 million a year that we did not budget last year. But we need to for the moving forward. That's just, it's an example of any decisions that we can help council make on the front end. Not only will streamline the process, but it will build in that sustainability piece, right? What is it that from a decision-making matrix, can we have council decide on the front end? Is it a difference between new development, infill, and redevelopment? Are there 3 different packages? So from our mindset, we're talking about a collaborative approach, a comprehensive approach moving forward. We have to have that. So it's less of a philosophy and it's more about the health fiscally of where we go next. We don't have the structure in place right now to provide council with those decision makings on the front end. We keep talking about baseline, right? And the piecemeal of the project by project by project, yet times have changed and we want Highway 7 to be a transit corridor. But the structure that has been in place for the last 20 years isn't necessarily designed for that. So this is just, it's a bigger, broader conversation to be able to say, we have to be able to be agile enough to make decisions, as many as we possibly can on the front end. And that's the direction we're going. So it's less about whether staff sees it or not. Sustainability is going to drive who we are as a community in every single component that we make, particularly in the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, I guess I appreciate that it's going to be part of a larger conversation. It needs to be part of a larger conversation. I guess what I would like to have is what that timeline looks for that larger conversation. How is that? How are those decisions being made? Is this going to be part of that conversation with staff internally to look at parking maximums or parking maximums as opposed to just staying with parking minimums? So I want to know yes or no on that. And then I think that, regarding the rest of the code, I think that Councilmember Linstead and I are ready to raise our hands and volunteer, be on the committee to look at the rest of the code. So just when you're ready, we're ready.
All right, so we're going to move on. Councilmember Marshall.
I was just going to say that obviously I support all of this tonight. I mean, I'm open to obviously if the large conversation.
I got you down for.
I would say the larger conversation needs to be like an all day long study session to deal with all of this as a comprehensive thing, and I'm open for that too. So. Thanks.
Thumbs up. Okay, Councilmember Hinkle.
Thank you for these conversations, and I think a lot of us, it looks like just from talking tonight and listening to everyone, and I appreciate you guys for the music today, section requests, and it just sounds like we need this retreat. That's what it sounds like to me. We have a brand new council and we need to make sure we give clear direction to staff. I just want to know what our vote means tonight. So if we say yes, does that mean you guys are devoting a ton of staff time to that front end that you're talking about that you aren't ready for?
Yes.
And a no vote just means that this is a fantastic idea. Let's flesh this out.
Well, I think it's kind of more into not a yes or no, but it is part of the larger conversation that we're having. And does it need to be a standalone study session?
Yeah.
So I was going to address this with Councilmember Holshin's request. I think he was going to address it, but is this also like, is this just like part of our priority discussion? It's something that we should be discussing at our field trip next week? Because that's what it sort of sounds like to me, is that these are items that we should be, these are priorities, these are things that we should be talking about and giving direction to staff as to whether it's parking or electrical vehicle policies. Those are things that we can discuss, and then give direction to council or to staff, saying, hey, these are things that we want to see happen.
But absolutely, and part of it is goal setting, right? I mean, for me, what's that? Councilmember Chapman had talked about the measurable outcomes, right? Like, what is a successful year? So even by the end, even if we're in the middle of 2022, what's a successful year realistically look like by the end of 2022? And then that helps define what we do in 2023 and 2024. Finance is a piece of that. And that's why we're having that conversation first, because that will really influence, quite frankly, where council directs staff time once that understanding is established. And again, it's not a one and done, right? So it's for the new council members, we need to do development 101 and 102 and 103. I know that the existing council members found that to be really helpful. And from a decision-making perspective, understanding what that structure looks like when you're sitting up here at the dais it's really key. Budget 101, 102, 103. I mean, the council that's been here for 2 years, the mayor and Mayor Pro Tem are, I mean, they're in the graduate level classes of all of those. But that said, we need to be able to have that equalizer for the new council to a certain degree, but nothing substitutes experience either. So.
I wanted to apologize, hang on, I didn't mean to cut you off in the middle. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Sure, Mayor. Feeling spicy tonight. No, like I just, I wasn't finished, but then also I can't remember what I wanted to add to it. But I will say, I think we also need to look and figure out what does 18A requests mean, and those sorts of things. I think that's also another thing that we should talk about, during our field trip. I love your term for that, Stan. We call it a work session, and really kind of flesh out this whole, request. And, maybe there's something before we even submit the request, or there are questions that we're going through. Can this be answered through policy that's already been working on or whatnot too? But I definitely, support these ideas. I just think, we do need a question. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Ward, you had a word. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna go back to Councilmember Ward to see if it was appropriate that his request is that we make sure we address this at our study session, not study session, but our focus session retreats next week.
No, I just want to clarify, when I brought this request forward, I did mean it in a larger context. Because I had like 15 different things, quite literally. I just didn't feel it appropriate to throw all of them at one meeting. So I thought this was the best way to handle it. But I'm willing to, I don't know if withdraw is the correct wording, but maybe table this for our field trip. So that way we can have that larger discussion. And this was really just my attempt to bring that discussion to the forefront. Quite frankly, I wasn't sure where this was, or if it was even being had, so I wanted to be brought forward.
We appreciate that.
Thank you. The next item of business for council's consideration this evening is Councilmember Ward's request for future action regarding amending a letter of support for Amtrak station development near Candelas. Before I ask Councilmember Ward, forget that. Nobody's going to listen anyway. Councilmember Ward, we've chatted about this, and you decided to circulate the letter among council, correct?
Yes, I guess you guys haven't heard me talk about it tonight. I will be just circulating a letter around to the rest of council requesting support for the creation of an Amtrak station near the Candelas development, because the city of Arvada has requested Amtrak to make that happen. My question for Manager Hoffman is, who on staff would do the best to help me draft that letter?
So can we follow up? Offline?
Yes.
Again, it's my understanding from my conversations with Arvada that there's already a letter drafted. So this is simply saying we support Arvada's pursuit. Correct?
Offline.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I forgot to ask for public comments, but I see one of our residents is wildly enthusiastic about this, so yay.
They need 5 hours.
All right, the final item.
I ride it 4 times a year.
Thank you, Ms. Jewell. The final item of business for council's consideration this evening is Councilmember Marsh Olson's request for future action regarding the initiation of a program to replace Broomfield vehicles and equipment with electric powered vehicles and equipment. James Marsh Olson, what have you decided?
I would like to also kind of focus into the discussion on.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's something much more appropriate in the whole, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll be there, you know,
Yep.
as many time limits. Perfect, thank you. Any public comments on that? That concludes the items on this evening's agenda. Is there any other business to come before the council? That's, you see, now it's fun. We try to be efficient, it's fun.
Did we wish everybody happy Tuesday?
Oh, it's two. Thank you, Mayor. That's gonna be a quote in the Enterprise. That concludes this items on this evening's agenda. Is there any other business to come before the council? There being no further business, the council